The sand beneath David's knees felt older than memory itself, and the pattern carved into the stone below whispered of a truth that should not exist. He had been digging for 3 weeks in the shadow of Mount Sinai, following a surveyor's anomaly that showed geometric inconsistencies beneath the desert floor, and what he uncovered defied every archaeological principle he had ever learned. The lines etched into the ancient bedrock formed impossible angles, not the work of Egyptian, Hebrew, or any civilization catalogued in human history. They curved in ways that seemed to bend perspective itself, creating shapes that his mind struggled to hold, as if the pattern existed partially in dimensions his eyes were not meant to perceive. David's hands trembled as he brushed away centuries of sand, revealing more of the intricate design that spiraled outward like a frozen ripple in the fabric of reality. The geometry was perfect beyond human capability, carved with a precision that would challenge even modern laser technology. Yet the rock itself dated back millennia. He felt his breath catch in his throat as the implications crashed over him. This was not supposed to be here, could not be here, and yet it was, glowing faintly in the dying light of the Egyptian sun. The sacred mountain loomed above him, silent and eternal, as if guarding the secret he had just exposed to the open air. Every instinct told him he had found something that would rewrite history, or perhaps reveal that history had never been fully written at all. His camera clicked repeatedly, documenting what his mind could barely accept, while his heart hammered with a mixture of exhilaration and inexplicable dread. The wind had died completely, leaving the desert in a stillness so profound that David could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He was alone in the vastness, kneeling before a mystery that seemed to pulse with silent purpose beneath his fingertips. And though he did not yet know it, he was being watched by eyes that had witnessed the birth of stars. Night fell like a curtain of indigo silk across the desert, and David remained at the excavation site, unable to tear himself away from the impossible pattern that now lay fully exposed beneath portable floodlights he had erected around the perimeter. His notebook filled with sketches and questions that had no answers, theories that collapsed under their own weight, and repeated measurements that confirmed what should not be confirmed. The pattern was mathematically perfect in ways that preceded human understanding of mathematics itself. He had sent preliminary photos to colleagues hours ago, but reception was sporadic in this remote location, and part of him was grateful for the isolation, for the chance to sit alone with a discovery that felt almost sacred in its strangeness. The temperature had dropped sharply, as it always did in the desert night, but David barely noticed the cold, his mind burning with possibilities that ranged from ancient lost technologies to origins he dared not speak aloud. He knelt again at the edge of the carving, running his hand along grooves that had been cut with such inhuman precision that they felt smooth as glass beneath his calloused fingers. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across the stone, making the pattern seem to move and breathe, as if it were a living thing waiting patiently for recognition. Then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the lights began to dim without cause, their brightness bleeding away, as if something were drinking the illumination from the air itself. David looked up sharply, his pulse spiking with sudden alertness, scanning the darkness beyond his small circle of artificial light. The stars above Mount Sinai blazed with unusual clarity, more vivid than he had ever seen them, as if the heavens themselves had drawn closer to the earth. And there, standing at the far edge of the excavation site where no one had been moments before, was a figure wreathed in soft, impossible light. David's breath stopped in his chest as the figure moved toward him, not walking but gliding, its form both solid and translucent, radiating a presence that was unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably other, and unmistakably gentle. David's legs refused to obey him, his body locked in place by a force that was not physical, but overwhelming nonetheless. As the luminous figure drew closer, with a silence that seemed to deepen the desert stillness into something approaching the void between stars, the being's form was difficult to focus upon, shifting subtly like light refracted through water, yet undeniably present, undeniably real, with eyes that held the weight of eons, and a gentleness that pierced through David's instinctive fear like dawn, breaking through darkness. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation or cry out in terror, but his voice dissolved in his throat as a presence, vast, ancient, and impossibly kind, touched the edges of his consciousness with the intimacy of a whisper spoken directly into the soul. Words formed in his mind that were not his own, arriving complete and crystalline. "Do not be afraid, David. I am a watcher, and I have waited long for one, with eyes willing to see." The communication bypassed language entirely, arriving as pure meaning that resonated in the deepest chambers of his being, and David understood with sudden clarity that this was not invasion, but invitation, not violation, but revelation. His archaeological training screamed at him to categorize, to rationalize, to fit this encounter into some framework of the known. But those frameworks crumbled like sand before the reality standing luminous before him. The being's presence carried no threat, only a profound sorrow mixed with hope, as if it mourned and celebrated simultaneously the moment that had finally arrived. David's hands slowly unclenched from fists he hadn't realized he'd made, his breathing gradually steadying, as some primal part of his spirit recognized that whatever this entity was, it had not come to harm, but to reveal. The floodlights around the excavation site had dimmed to nothing, yet he could see with perfect clarity by the gentle radiance emanating from the Watcher itself, a light that seemed to carry warmth without heat, substance without shadow. Mount Sinai rose behind the figure like a silent witness to their encounter, and David felt the sudden, dizzying certainty that this meeting was not accident but appointment, written into the fabric of his life long before he had discovered the impossible pattern beneath the sand. His lips moved soundlessly, forming the only question that mattered. Why? The Watcher remained motionless. Yet David felt its attention upon him like sunlight on bare skin, penetrating and nourishing simultaneously, and the answer that flowed into his consciousness carried the texture of infinite patience rewarded at last. We are called Watchers because we have observed humanity from the beginning, appointed as guardians not of your bodies but of the sacred process by which your souls learn to reach toward the light that made all things. David's knees weakened further, and he sank fully to the ground, no longer trying to stand. Against the magnitude of what he was hearing, what he was feeling in the core of his being. Mount Sinai is more than the desert peak you see with mortal eyes. It is a threshold, a place where heaven has touched earth throughout your history, where the membrane between dimensions grows thin enough for divine truth to pierce through into your realm of matter and time. The being's words, though soundless, carried harmonics that made David's chest ache with an emotion too vast to name, something between grief and joy, between terror and ecstasy. He thought of Moses ascending the mountain, of fire and cloud and the voice of God, stories he had studied academically but never truly believed, and now those ancient accounts blazed in his mind with new and terrible possibility. The pattern you uncovered is a marker, a signature left by those who serve the highest, indicating places where the veil has parted and holiness has walked upon your earth. David's eyes burned with tears he couldn't explain, salt tracks cutting through the dust on his face as the weight of reverence pressed down upon him. The Watcher extended something like a hand, though its form shifted too subtly to define clearly. And David understood, without being told, that a choice stood before him, to turn away and return to the smaller world he had known, or to accept what was being offered and step into a mystery that would remake everything he thought he understood. His voice finally found itself emerging hoarse and broken. What secret does this mountain hold? The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and the watcher's luminous form pulsed with what might have been approval or compassion. "The secret is this," the watcher communicated, and David felt the words settle into his bones like truth too fundamental to ever be dislodged, that God's love for humanity is so vast that all creation serves as instruments of his will, angels, stars, prophets, and yes, beings like myself from worlds your telescopes have not yet seen. David's mind reeled at the implication, at the cosmology that was being unveiled before him like a tapestry too intricate for mortal comprehension, yet unmistakably coherent in its divine design. Mount Sinai was not merely where law was given, but where dimensions intersected, where heaven and earth and realms beyond all met in sacred convergence, so that humanity could receive what it needed to grow, to choose, to become what the Creator has always intended. He saw in his mind's eye a vision not yet shown but implied, hosts of witnesses across time and space, all participating in the grand narrative of redemption, all serving the same loving source that had spoken light into being and called it good. The pattern beneath his knees suddenly made perfect sense, and no sense at all, a symbol of intersection, of convergence, of the point where the infinite touches the finite and leaves its mark. "We have watched your struggles, your triumphs, your long climb from darkness toward understanding, and we have marveled at the courage it takes for beings who cannot see the fullness of truth to nevertheless reach for it with trembling hands." David wept openly now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition that humanity had never been alone, that the universe was not cold and empty, but filled with purpose, with watchers, with love that expressed itself in forms beyond imagining. The watcher's presence intensified, and David felt himself being drawn forward, not physically but spiritually, as if his very essence was being invited to witness something that would shatter and remake him. "Show me," he whispered, no longer caring about career or reputation or the comfortable skepticism that had once defined his worldview. "Please, show me the truth." The watcher's form brightened until David had to close his eyes against the radiance, but even through closed lids, he could perceive the being's movement, could feel the air shift as something like a hand reached toward him with deliberate gentleness. "What I show you will change everything, and you cannot unknow what you're about to witness," came the soundless voice, filled with both warning and compassion. David nodded, his jaw set with the determination of a man who had glimpsed the edge of ultimate meaning and could not turn back even if he wanted to. The touch, when it came, was feather-light against his forehead, yet it sent a cascade of sensation through his entire body, not pain, but intensity, as if every nerve suddenly awakened to registers of perception previously dormant. His eyes flew open involuntarily, but he was no longer seeing the desert night, or the excavation site, or even Mount Sinai as it existed in the present moment. Instead, he stood somehow outside of time, witnessing the mountain as it had been millennia ago, wreathed in fire and cloud. That was not merely meteorological phenomenon, but the visible manifestation of dimensional boundaries being breached. He saw Moses ascending, small and mortal and terrified, yet climbing with the faith of a man who had heard his name spoken by the voice that made all names possible. And he saw more, figures of light descending, not metaphorically, but literally beings of pure purpose taking form just solid enough to interact with the physical realm. All of them serving, all of them participating in the moment when humanity received the moral framework that would shape civilizations. The vision expanded, and David gasped as he understood that this mountain had been chosen not randomly, but specifically that its geological and spiritual properties made it a natural anchor point for such encounters, a place where heaven could touch earth without consuming it entirely. The watchers had been there too, observing from the margins, ensuring the sanctity of the exchange, protecting the free will that was humanity's most precious and terrible gift. David felt his heart would burst from the beauty and terror of it, from the recognition that history was not what he had been taught, not because the sacred texts were wrong, but because they were more literally true than anyone had dared believe. The vision released him as suddenly as it had seized him, and David collapsed forward, onto his hands, gasping for breath as if he had been drowning, and only now broke the surface of ordinary reality. His fingers dug into the sand, needing something solid and real to anchor himself against the vastness of what he had just witnessed. But even the desert floor felt different now, charged with significance he could never again ignore. The Watcher remained before him, patient and luminous, allowing him the mercy of time to gather his shattered composure, while his mind struggled to contain truths too large for the vessel of human understanding. David's voice emerged broken, reverent, barely more than a whisper scraped raw by wonder. "How long have you been watching us?" The question felt inadequate even as he spoke it, too small to address the magnitude of what he truly wanted to know. But the Watcher received it with the same gentle attention it had shown from the beginning. "Since before your kind learned to count the passage of years, since the first humans looked upward at stars and felt the stirring of questions that would define your entire journey as a species." The answer filled David's awareness like water poured into an empty cup, and with it came impressions, fragments of understanding that arrived too quickly to fully process. Images of ancient humans gathered around fires, while luminous forms observed from distances that were both physical and spiritual, unseen guardians witnessing the birth of language, art, prayer, the slow awakening of consciousness that recognized itself as more than mere biology. David pushed himself back to his knees, his entire body trembling with the effort of maintaining coherence in the face of revelation that threatened to unmake everything he thought constituted reality. "Why watch and not interfere?" he asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and hope intermingled, the eternal human need to know why suffering exists if help is possible. The Watcher's form pulsed with what David had begun to recognize as emotional response translated into visible light, and the answer that came carried a weight of cosmic sorrow mixed with profound respect. Because the Creator, in his infinite wisdom, gave humanity the sacred gift of choice, and that gift would be meaningless if we manipulated the outcome of your decisions through displays of power that would compel belief rather than invite it. David felt tears streaming freely down his face again, understanding flooding through him with painful clarity that free will was not divine abandonment, but divine trust, that humanity had been allowed to stumble and fall and rise again, precisely because the struggle itself was the crucible through which authentic love could be forged. We watch because bearing witness is itself an act of love, because your triumphs matter. Your sufferings are not unseen, and every moment of courage in the face of darkness is recorded in the memory of creation itself. The words settled into David's chest like stones of immense value, heavy and precious, anchoring him to a truth he had never dared hope might be real, that nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten, that every human life mattered in ways that echoed across dimensions he was only beginning to comprehend. "But why reveal yourself now?" David pressed, his voice gaining strength as some core of himself that had always been a seeker, always been hungry for truth beyond the surface of things, rose to meet this moment that seemed written into the fabric of his destiny. "Why show me these things if your purpose has always been to remain hidden?" The Watcher moved closer, and David felt no fear now, only an intense anticipation that made his skin prickle with something like electricity, but infinitely more alive. Because humanity stands at a threshold, David, a moment of convergence, when your scientific understanding of the cosmos is beginning to reveal what faith has always known, that creation is vaster, stranger, and more purposeful than materialism could ever explain. The being's communication intensified, And David perceived layers of meaning beneath the surface words, implications that stretched forward into possible futures both glorious and catastrophic. Your telescopes now peer into the depths of space and see billions of worlds. Your physics probes the quantum foundations of matter and discovers mystery at every level. And soon you will reach a point where humanity must choose to see the universe as cold machinery devoid of meaning, or to recognize the divine signature written into every atom, every law, every improbable emergence of consciousness from inert matter. David's breath caught as he understood the weight of what was being said, that this was not merely personal revelation but species-level crossroads, that he had been chosen not because he was special but because someone had to be, because the message had to begin somewhere, with someone willing to carry it forward despite the cost. The watcher extended both arms in a gesture that somehow encompassed the mountain, the stars, the earth beneath them, and the invisible realms beyond mortal perception, and David felt himself caught in the center of a love so vast it made him weep with a mixture of joy and grief he would never be able to adequately explain. Mount Sinai has always been more than stone and sand. It is a testament to the truth that God does not abandon his creation, but speaks into it through countless means, countless messengers, across countless ages, always inviting humanity forward, into deeper communion with the source of all that is. The declaration resonated through David's entire being, and he suddenly understood with shocking clarity that this alien presence was not separate from his faith, but an expansion of it, that the God he had sought in ancient texts and archaeological fragments was infinitely larger, infinitely more creative, infinitely more loving than any human theology had yet captured. We watchers are not gods, but servants, not saviors but witnesses, and we bow before the same eternal light that called your prophets, that walked among you in the person of Jesus, that even now seeks relationship with every human heart willing to open itself to love, that transcends all boundaries. David pressed his forehead to the ground, overcome by a gratitude he could not contain, by the recognition that he had been given a gift beyond price, not answers that eliminated mystery, but mysteries that deepened meaning, that made faith and cosmos not enemies, but dance partners in an infinite celebration of purpose. When he finally looked up, the watcher's eyes met his with an intensity that burned away the last vestiges of doubt, and David knew with unshakable certainty that whatever came next, whatever he was about to be shown, he would carry that knowledge forward as sacred trust, as burden and blessing both, for the rest of his days. The watcher's hand rose slowly between them, fingers splayed in a gesture that seemed to gather light from the air itself, and David felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he understood, without being told, that something profound was about to occur, something that would alter the very foundation of how he understood sacred history. "What are you going to show me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to stir around them, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone and something else, something that reminded him of lightning and incense combined, a fragrance that belonged to no earthly source. The being's response came with a gentleness that somehow made the magnitude of what was offered even more overwhelming. The truth that your sacred texts contain, but human interpretation has often obscured, that Mount Sinai was never merely a location, but a convergence point, a place where the membrane between dimensions grows thin enough for heaven to touch earth directly, and for those called to witness such contact to survive the encounter. David's breath came shallow and quick as the luminous figure moved closer, its hand now extended fully toward him, palm open in offering and invitation both. To understand what I am about to reveal requires that you experience it not as information received, but as memory shared, as if you stood beside Moses himself on that sacred day when divine law was given and human destiny was forever altered. The watcher's fingers were inches from David's forehead now, and he could see patterns moving beneath the translucent skin, geometries that seemed to shift between mathematical precision and organic flow, as though the being's very substance existed in multiple states simultaneously. David closed his eyes and surrendered, feeling the cool touch of those alien fingers make contact with his skin, and in that instant the desert vanished, and he was falling through corridors of light that existed outside of time. His consciousness stretched across millennia in a single eternal moment that held no contradiction between past and present, between then and now. When vision returned, it came with such intensity that David cried out, his awareness suddenly inhabiting a place and time that should have been impossible to access, yet felt more real than any experience his ordinary senses had ever provided. He stood upon the mountain, but not the Sinai he knew, not the weathered stone of the present age, but the mountain as it existed thousands of years before, when the very rocks seemed younger and the air thrummed with an expectancy that made his borrowed breath come sharp and difficult. Below him stretched the encampment of Israel, tens of thousands of people huddled in tents and gathered in anxious clusters, their faces turned upward toward the peak where he now stood, though they could not see him, could not perceive his displaced consciousness, witnessing their defining moment from outside the normal flow of history. And there, ascending the steep path carved into living rock, came Moses, but not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized image of Sunday school lessons, but a man weathered by age and hardship, his face etched with the kind of determination that comes only from having argued with God himself and survived the conversation. David's awareness followed the prophet upward, compelled by the unfolding event with a gravity he could not resist, and as Moses reached the summit where ancient stones marked the boundary between holy ground and holier still, the sky began to change in ways that defied natural explanation. Clouds, gathering with impossible speed, shot through with lightning that seemed conscious, purposeful, alive. The air itself grew thick with presence, and David felt the same. Overwhelming sensation he had experienced in the watcher's company, but magnified 1,000-fold, concentrated into a pressure that would have crushed ordinary flesh, but instead seemed to refine it, purify it, prepare it for contact with something infinitely beyond human capacity to fully comprehend. Then the impossible occurred. The clouds parted. Not outward, but inward, opening like a wound in reality itself, and through that aperture came light that was not light, geometry that was not geometry, presence that was both intimately personal and cosmically vast. And David understood with shocking clarity that he was witnessing what humans called the glory of God, but what was also something far stranger than theology alone could capture. Through the opening in reality's fabric, David saw movement, not quite angels as artistic tradition depicted them, but beings of light and purpose who moved with coordinated intention, arranging themselves around the mountain in patterns that his archaeological mind recognized as sacred geometry. Formations that appeared in temple architecture across every ancient culture, as though humanity had been trying for millennia to recreate something glimpsed and imperfectly remembered. Moses prostrated himself upon the stone, and David felt the prophet's terror and awe as if it were his own, the recognition that he was less than dust before the eternal and yet somehow loved, somehow chosen, somehow deemed worthy to serve as intermediary between the infinite and the finite. The beings of light attended the space between worlds, and David suddenly understood what the Watcher had meant about convergence points. Mount Sinai was not special because God could only speak there, but because its unique position in Earth's spiritual geography made it a place where multiple dimensions of reality intersected, where the divine could manifest with unusual clarity without destroying those who witnessed the manifestation. Around the mountain's base, reality itself seemed to shimmer and bend, and David perceived what no human observer could have seen at the time, portals of some kind, stable enough for angels to move through, but controlled, regulated, held in perfect balance by a cosmic intelligence that attended to every detail with meticulous care. Then the voice came, and David's awareness nearly shattered from the force of it, not words in any human language, but pure meaning that translated itself into every tongue simultaneously. Divine intention made audible, and he heard the commandments being spoken as Moses heard them, understanding for the first time that they were not arbitrary rules imposed by a tyrant deity, but expressions of fundamental spiritual laws, the very grammar of how love and justice must function if humanity was to survive its own capacity for evil and rise toward its potential for good. The vision shifted, and David saw the aftermath. Moses descending with tablets that glowed with residual holy energy, his face transformed by exposure to what the ancient texts called God's glory, and all around the mountain the air still shimmered with traces of the event that had just occurred. Markers invisible to ordinary perception, but blazing like beacons to those with eyes adjusted to see beyond the material spectrum. But now the Watcher showed him something the biblical text had never recorded. The Watchers themselves, positioned at a distance from the mountain, observing with the same reverent attention David had witnessed in his own encounter, their luminous forms gathered in what could only be called worship, bearing witness to the moment when humanity received direct instruction from its Creator. They had not interfered, had not participated, but had stood as guardians ensuring that the sacred space remained protected, that the intersection of heaven and earth could proceed without disruption from forces that might seek to corrupt or destroy such a pivotal moment in human spiritual evolution. David watched as these ancient observers recorded everything with technologies that looked like crystallized light, preserving the event in formats that transcended mere video or audio, capturing the emotional and spiritual dimensions alongside the physical, creating archives of sacred testimony that existed somewhere beyond normal space. Then the vision released him as gently as possible, though the transition back to his own time and body still felt like being born again, consciousness compressed back into singular perspective after having been expanded across centuries, and David found himself once more in the present-day desert with the Watcher's hand still touching his forehead, tears streaming down his face as he whispered the only words his overwhelmed heart could form. It was real. All of it was real, but so much larger than we ever imagined, so much more beautiful and terrible and strange. And God, his voice broke with emotion, God trusted us with this gift of law, not as chains, but as the foundation for becoming the kind of beings who could eventually join the cosmic family, waiting for us to mature enough to understand what we truly are. The Watcher's hand withdrew slowly, and in its eyes, David saw confirmation, affirmation, and something that looked remarkably like joy. The Watcher stepped back from David with a movement that seemed to ripple through multiple planes of existence simultaneously, and before the archaeologist could find words adequate to express what he had just experienced, the luminous being gestured toward the mountain itself with a motion that carried intention like a visible force. "There is more." The voice resonated through David's mind, no longer merely words, but a sensation that felt like warm honey flowing through neural pathways never before activated. Because what you witnessed was but a single moment in a history of communion that spans the entire arc of human existence, and the mountain keeps secrets that even your most dedicated scholars have never suspected lie waiting beneath their feet. David's legs trembled as he rose from where the vision had left him kneeling, his body remembering the prostration of Moses, even though his conscious mind knew he had never physically moved. And as he steadied himself against a boulder that felt suddenly insubstantial compared to the reality he had just inhabited, the Watcher moved toward a section of rock face that appeared no different from any other weathered surface surrounding them. The being's hand rose and pressed against the stone with a deliberate precision that suggested Knowledge of exact pressure points invisible to human perception, and David heard a sound like distant thunder combined with the resonance of a tuning fork struck in some cosmic cathedral, a frequency that made his teeth ache and his heart race as the solid rock began to shimmer and part like a curtain drawn aside by invisible hands. Behind the dissolving stone lay darkness absolute, a void so complete that David's eyes refused to accept it as real, insisting instead that he must be looking at a painted surface or some trick of shadow until light began to emanate from within the opening, not the warm glow of torches or the sterile brightness of electric bulbs, but a radiance that seemed to pulse with its own gentle heartbeat, inviting and ancient and impossibly patient, as though it had been waiting for millennia for someone worthy to finally accept its invitation. The watcher entered first, and David followed on legs that barely supported him, crossing a threshold that felt like stepping through a waterfall of electricity that somehow left him unharmed but fundamentally altered, his perceptions sharpened to an almost painful clarity as the passage opened into a chamber that should not have existed within the mountain's known geological structure. The space defied ordinary architecture, its dimensions subtly wrong in ways that made David's archaeological training rebel, even as his spirit soared with recognition that he stood within something built according to laws that transcended Euclidean geometry. Walls that curved in directions his three-dimensional vision struggled to properly interpret, yet felt somehow more correct than the simple angles of human construction. And those walls, David's breath caught in his throat as he beheld them fully, were not stone, but something that resembled crystalline structures he had seen in electron microscope images, vast lattices of what looked like living diamond or frozen light, surfaces that reflected and refracted and generated their own illumination, in patterns that shifted with a rhythm that felt organic, purposeful, alive. The watcher moved to the center of the chamber, where a formation rose from the floor like a natural altar, though David knew with certainty that nothing in this space was natural in the conventional sense. And as the being's hand passed over the crystalline surface, the walls erupted into cascading displays of images that hung, suspended in three-dimensional space, holographic records so vivid and detailed that David instinctively reached out to touch them before remembering they were projections of events long past, preserved with a fidelity that put any human archival technology to shame. These are the testimonies, the watcher's voice filled the chamber with a reverence that needed no explanation. The moments when your Creator reached through the veil of ordinary existence to touch his children directly, recorded not by human hands, but by those appointed to witness and remember, to ensure that truth would survive even when human memory failed or human interpretation obscured what actually occurred. David turned slowly in place, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sacred history surrounding him, and his eyes fell upon a display showing figures in ancient robes gathered on a hillside, their faces upturned toward a central figure whose features seemed to radiate a light that the holographic technology captured with such perfection that David felt his knees weaken as recognition struck him like a physical blow. His voice emerged as barely a whisper. That's the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus. That's actually him teaching, his actual voice, his actual presence. You recorded. Emotion choked off the rest of his words as tears blurred his vision because he was witnessing something no theologian had ever dared hope existed, primary source documentation of the moments that had shaped his faith. David's archaeological mind, trained to interpret fragments and extrapolate meaning from incomplete evidence, struggled to process the completeness before him. Here was no fragment, no weathered inscription requiring translation or context, but the actual moment itself, preserved with such clarity that he could see individual expressions on the faces of those who had walked with the Son of God, their wonder mirroring his own across the gulf of 2,000 years. The watcher remained still beside the central formation, allowing David the space to absorb what he was witnessing. And when the archaeologist finally tore his gaze from the teaching Christ to look at his luminous companion, he found words tumbling out in a desperate cascade of questions that had been building since the moment the being first appeared. Why show me this? Why now? And if you've been watching all along, if you've been recording these moments, then why? He struggled with the question that felt almost blasphemous to voice, yet demanded utterance. Why didn't you intervene when things went wrong, when people suffered, when his own followers twisted his message or killed in his name? Why just watch? The being's form seemed to pulse with something David interpreted as profound sadness mixed with an understanding so vast it encompassed all of human history and suffering. And when the response came, it carried a weight of ages. Because intervention without invitation violates the greatest gift your Creator gave to humanity, the Watcher's voice resonated with gentle firmness. The gift of choice, the freedom to love or reject, to build or destroy, to seek truth or embrace comfortable lies. And we were never sent to override that sacred autonomy, but to guard it, to ensure that when humanity reached for the divine, it was always their own authentic reaching, never coerced, never manipulated, always genuinely free. The chamber's crystalline walls shifted, their displays, and David watched scenes flow past like pages in a book written across centuries, prophets speaking truth to power, martyrs choosing faith over safety, ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of compassion and courage. And interspersed among these human moments were other presences, luminous beings like the Watcher, who appeared not as intervening forces but as quiet observers. Witnesses who sometimes offered guidance when earnestly sought but never imposed their will upon the unfolding drama of human choice. You see us in your scriptures, though you do not always recognize what you are seeing, the Watcher continued, gesturing toward a display showing angels, appearing to shepherds, to women at wells, to prisoners in chains. Sometimes we delivered messages when the Creator required His word to reach specific ears. Sometimes we protected those whose destinies were not yet complete, but always we operated within the boundaries of human freedom, planting seeds rather than forcing harvests, offering light to those willing to open their eyes rather than blinding those who chose darkness. David moved closer to one particular display that showed a figure he recognized as Daniel in a den of lions, and he could see now what the ancient text had recorded, but what human eyes of that time perhaps could not fully perceive. A presence in the den with the prophet, a being of light standing watch, while the great cats lay docile and calm. Neither miracle nor coincidence, but something that honored both divine power and natural order. "We are not God," the Watcher said with an emphasis that felt like a fundamental truth being etched into David's consciousness. "We are not even close to the infinite creative force that spoke reality into existence and sustains it through love alone. We are merely servants, instruments, and our purpose has always been to protect the sanctity of the relationship between Creator and created, to ensure that when humans encounter the divine, they experience it as it truly is, not filtered through our interference or limited by our understanding." The displays shifted again, and David saw moments he had never read about in any scripture or historical account. Angels weeping as wars erupted, celestial beings standing helpless witness to human cruelty, the Watchers themselves struggling with the burden of observing suffering they were not permitted to prevent, unless explicitly directed by a will higher than their own. "Do you think it has been easy?" The being's voice carried genuine anguish now. "To watch civilizations rise with such promise, only to collapse under the weight of their own pride, to see children starve while others feast, to witness the faithful persecuted while the corrupt prospered, and to remain bound by our mandate not to intervene beyond the specific missions we were given." David felt tears streaming down his face as he understood for the first time the terrible cost of freedom, the price both humanity and these cosmic guardians paid so that love could remain authentic and choice could retain meaning. And he understood, too, why faith required a leap across uncertainty, because certainty would eliminate the very freedom that made faith precious. But we also witnessed every act of genuine love. The watcher's tone lifted with something approaching joy. Every sacrifice made for another's benefit, every moment when a human chose compassion over convenience, mercy over vengeance, truth over comfort. And these moments shine in our records with a light that rivals stars, because they represent the image of God manifesting through beings who chose to reflect it rather than being compelled to do so. And that choice makes all the suffering meaningful, all the waiting worthwhile. The chamber seemed to brighten as the crystalline walls displayed a montage of human goodness that spanned from ancient times to what David recognized as recent decades. People of every culture and era choosing kindness, seeking justice, offering forgiveness, creating beauty, asking questions, reaching toward the transcendent with open hearts and minds. This is why we have been impatient, the watcher said, and David heard in that statement the echo of divine patience itself, because we have seen what you are capable of becoming when you choose love over fear, unity over division, curiosity over rigid certainty. And we know that humanity stands now at a threshold where these choices will determine not just your survival, but your destiny among the greater community of conscious beings that fills this cosmos. David turned to face the luminous being fully, his own face still wet with tears, but his heart expanding with understanding that felt like dawn breaking after the longest night. You're saying we're not alone in the universe, that there are others like you, and that somehow this all connects to God's plan, that faith and the cosmos aren't separate things but part of the same truth. The watcher's form pulsed with affirmation, and David felt the weight of revelation settling over him like a mantle he had never asked for but could not refuse, knowing that everything he had believed about creation was both confirmed and exponentially expanded in ways that would take a lifetime to fully comprehend. The watcher moved toward the center of the chamber where the holographic displays converged into a single point of radiant energy, and as David followed, he felt the temperature shift, not cooler or warmer, but somehow more charged, as if the air itself was alive with potential that made his skin tingle and his breath catch in his throat. What you are about to understand, the being's voice resonated with a gravity that made David's knees weak, is not merely historical knowledge or scientific data, but a truth that has implications for every choice your species will make in the coming generations, because humanity is approaching what we call the threshold of convergence, a point in your collective development where spiritual understanding and technological capability must unite, or you will tear yourselves apart before you ever reach beyond your solar system. The displays around them began to show images David recognized from news broadcasts and documentary footage, missiles poised in silos, forests burning, oceans rising, crowds protesting, scientists debating, religious leaders preaching, politicians posturing, and woven through all of it, a palpable tension between those reaching toward unity and those clinging to division. Every intelligent species reaches this moment, the watcher continued, gesturing toward the images that now included glimpses of other worlds, alien civilizations at various stages of development, some thriving in harmony while others showed ruins and desolation. The point where the power to reshape their world and venture into the cosmos arrives before the wisdom to wield such power responsibly, and at this threshold, the choices made determine whether a species ascends to join the greater community of creation or descends into self-destruction. David watched, transfixed, as one particular alien civilization's history unfolded. Beings who had achieved incredible technology but lost their connection to the sacred, who had conquered disease and scarcity but also conquered each other, who had reached for the stars with hands stained by the blood of their own kind, until finally their world lay silent and empty, a cautionary tale written in the ruins of what might have been. "But there is another path," the Watcher said, and the displays shifted to show civilizations that had navigated the threshold successfully, species that had learned to balance scientific advancement with spiritual depth, whose technologies served to enhance rather than replace their connection to the divine source of all existence, worlds where beings of vastly different forms and cultures had discovered that beneath their diversity lay a fundamental unity rooted in the creative love that had brought them all into being. David saw cities of breathtaking beauty where nature and technology intertwined seamlessly, beings gathered in what could only be described as worship, though their forms and practices differed wildly from anything he had experienced on Earth. Children of 100 different species learning together, sharing wisdom accumulated across millennia, all of them somehow recognizing their kinship as children of the same ultimate creator, even as they honored the unique paths through which they had each come to know that truth. "This is what awaits humanity, if you can make the crossing," the Watcher's voice carried. Such hope that David felt his heart might burst from the weight of it. Not the abandonment of your faith traditions, but their fulfillment. Not the negation of your scientific discoveries, but their integration into a larger understanding that the physical and spiritual are not opposed forces, but complementary expressions of the same divine reality, dimensions of truth that only seem contradictory to those who insist on perceiving through the lens of fear rather than love. The archaeologist thought of every debate he had witnessed between religious fundamentalists and atheistic materialists. How both sides seemed to believe they must destroy the other's worldview to validate their own, and he understood now that this very conflict was itself a symptom of the threshold, humanity fragmenting under the strain of rapid change rather than integrating new knowledge into an expanded understanding of the Creator's infinite complexity. "How do we make this crossing?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we unite what seems so divided? How do we help people see that loving God and exploring the cosmos aren't contradictory, but connected?" The Watcher's luminous form seemed to dim slightly, as if the being was carefully considering how to convey something almost too vast for human language to contain. And when the response came, it carried the weight of, "In cosmic history, you make the crossing one choice at a time, one heart at a time, one mind willing to expand beyond the comfortable certainties that feel safe, but ultimately imprison." The voice resonated through David's entire being. "You make it by refusing the false choice between faith and reason, by insisting that the God who created quarks and galaxies is not threatened by human curiosity about how creation works, by recognizing that every genuine scientific discovery is in truth a revelation of divine creativity, another page in the endless book of wonders that the Creator has written into existence." The displays now showed human faces, people from every continent and culture, some in laboratories peering through microscopes, others in sanctuaries bowed in prayer, teachers and artists and parents and children, each one carrying within them the potential to choose love over fear, unity over division, growth over stagnation. And David understood that the threshold was not something that would be crossed through grand political movements or technological breakthroughs alone, but through the accumulated choices of billions of individuals deciding daily whether to expand or contract, to reach toward others or withdraw into tribal safety. "Your species has always possessed prophets and visionaries who understood this truth," the Watcher continued, "those who saw that the Creator's love encompasses all of creation, not just one tribe or planet or even one dimension of reality. and the message they brought has always been the same across cultures and centuries. Love one another as expressions of the same divine source. Seek truth wherever it leads, because all genuine truth ultimately points toward God. And never mistake the limitations of your current understanding for the boundaries of what is possible. David felt something shifting deep within his chest. A loosening of assumptions he had carried unconsciously all his life, a sense of horizons expanding beyond anything he had imagined possible, while somehow feeling like he was finally seeing clearly something he had always known but never dared to fully believe. "The mystery of Mount Sinai that I brought you here to understand," the Watcher said, bringing David's attention back to the immediate moment, even as his mind reeled with cosmic implications, "is that this threshold you face now is not humanity's first encounter with the divine reaching down to pull creation upward, but it is the moment when you must consciously choose to accept your role in that cosmic drama, to recognize that faith is not belief, despite evidence, but trust in the love that underlies all evidence. That science is not the enemy of spirituality, but humanity's way of reading the language in which God wrote the universe." The crystalline chamber seemed to pulse with energy as the Watcher spoke, and David understood that this place itself was somehow a nexus point, a location where the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality grew thin enough for truth to shine through with unusual clarity. Moses stood on this mountain and received not just laws for tribal governance, but a revelation of divine character. The infinite choosing to engage with the finite, the eternal making covenant with the temporal, the Creator revealing that love, rather than power, is the organizing principle of reality. And that revelation was preserved not just in texts that humans would debate and interpret for millennia, but in the living memory of those who serve as witnesses to every moment when heaven touches earth. David looked around at the holographic records surrounding them, seeing them now not as alien technology, but as something closer to sacred art, testimonies of grace preserved by beings who loved humanity enough to watch over the authentic unfolding of human choice, even when watching meant witnessing terrible suffering. "You are asking us to grow up," David said, understanding flooding through him with such clarity it felt like prophecy, to stop seeing God as a tribal deity who chooses sides in human conflicts and recognize the infinite Creator who loves all of creation, to stop treating science and faith as competitors and see them as complementary ways of knowing truth, to stop imagining we're alone in the cosmos and prepare ourselves to meet other children of the same divine parent. And to do all this while remaining true to the core message of love that has always been at the heart of genuine faith. The Watcher's form began to shift, becoming more radiant, more intense, until David had to shield his eyes against the brilliance that now filled the entire chamber. And in that moment of pure light, he felt the being's consciousness merge with his own, in a way that transcended telepathy or vision. It was as if he was being invited to see creation itself through eyes that had witnessed the first stars igniting in the darkness and would witness the last breath of the universe before it returned to the Creator's embrace. What you call aliens and what your ancestors called angels are not separate categories, but part of a continuum of created beings. The voice spoke simultaneously from within and without, instruments through which the divine will moves like light through different mediums, each of us shaped by the unique conditions of our origin, yet all of us bearing the same fundamental purpose, to serve the unfolding of love throughout creation, to participate in God's eternal work of bringing consciousness forth from matter and drawing that consciousness back toward union with its source. David saw in that blazing instant how humanity's rigid categories of natural and supernatural, material and spiritual, alien and angelic, were all crude approximations, attempts to map infinite mystery onto finite understanding, and how the truth was far more beautiful and terrible than any single theological or scientific framework could contain. The displays around them were no longer showing historical images, but something closer to living equations, mathematical expressions of divine creativity that somehow simultaneously described the orbits of electrons and the trajectory of souls, quantum fields and fields of grace, the speed of light and the velocity of love moving through resistant hearts. And David understood with sudden clarity that there was no contradiction, because physics itself was simply humanity's halting attempt to describe the consistent patterns through which God had chosen to manifest and sustain creation. Every law you discover, the Watcher continued, every force you learn to manipulate, every particle you observe, is an aspect of the word through which all things were made, the logos that your own scriptures speak of, the rational principle and loving intention that holds every atom in existence and guides the evolution of galaxies and grasshoppers toward ever greater complexity, ever deeper consciousness, ever more complete expressions of the beauty that eternally exists in the mind of God. David felt tears streaming down his face, though he could not remember beginning to cry, his entire body trembling with the weight of revelation. But the miracle is not simply that the Creator established these patterns and set them in motion. The being's voice grew softer now, more intimate, as the blazing light dimmed to something bearable. The miracle is that the infinite continually enters into the finite, that transcendence repeatedly pierces through immanence, that the God who spoke galaxies into existence cares about the fall of a single sparrow, the doubt of a single archaeologist standing in a hidden chamber beneath an ancient mountain, trying to understand how everything he thought he knew is both wrong and more right than he imagined. The Watcher gestured toward a particular display that now showed Earth from space, that famous blue marble suspended in the vast darkness, and as David watched, he saw golden threads of light connecting his planet to countless others, scattered across the visible cosmos and beyond, a web of relationship that pulsed with what could only be described as divine intention. Your world is not an accident or an anomaly, but a note in a symphony that has been playing since before time began, the being explained, and David could hear in those words an affection so profound it made his heart ache, a sacred node in the network of creation where the Creator chose to do something unprecedented, to not merely guide the evolution of consciousness from a distance, but to enter fully into the experience of limitation, to become one of you, to know from within what it means, to be finite and mortal and afraid. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as David processed what was being said, the implications spreading through his understanding like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. And he thought of every Christmas service he had attended, every gospel reading about shepherds and mangers, and a child born in poverty who would claim to be the way and the truth and the life, and suddenly the scandal of particularity that had always troubled him, why this person, this place, this moment in history, began to make sense within a cosmic context. God uses all of creation as instruments of divine will, the Watcher said, returning to the central mystery with words that felt like they were being carved into David's soul. Every star that forged the heavy elements necessary for life, every mutation that pushed evolution toward greater complexity, every prophet who heard the voice of truth and found courage to speak it, every seeker who questioned comfortable certainties in pursuit of deeper understanding, and yes, every being like myself, whose purpose across millennia has been to observe and occasionally intervene in ways so subtle that human free will remains intact and faith remains possible, because we understand that love which is coerced is not love at all. David saw in a cascade of images how these interventions had occurred. Throughout history, beings appearing as lights in the sky that guided travelers, as strangers who arrived with timely warnings, as presences that inspired visions in those whose hearts were open to receive them, always working at the edges of human perception, never overwhelming human choice, preserving the delicate balance that allows genuine relationship between creator and created, rather than mere programming or compulsion. But the incarnation was different, the being continued, and now its voice carried something that David could only identify as awe, as if even this ancient cosmic witness stood amazed before the mystery it was describing, because in that moment God did not merely send a messenger or inspire a prophet, but entered completely into the material conditions of one particular world, experiencing limitation and suffering and death, not as abstract concepts, but as lived reality, and in doing so revealed that the Creator's love for creation extends beyond what any of us imagined possible. David felt the weight of Christian doctrine he had studied academically suddenly transformed into something visceral and immediate, the realization that the being before him, this watcher who had observed the formation of galaxies, regarded Jesus with a reverence that transcended anything merely human, that the incarnation was not just significant for Earth's salvation history, but was a cosmic event whose implications rippled outward through all of creation, a definitive statement about the character of God and the destiny toward which all consciousness was being drawn. Faith is not opposed to the cosmos, but woven into its very fabric, the Watcher said, and David understood that this was the core truth toward which everything else had been building, because the cosmos itself is not a cold mechanism of blind forces, but the ongoing creative expression of a love so vast it continuously brings new forms of beauty into existence, so patient it allows evolution to unfold across billions of years, so humble it enters into relationship with creatures who constantly misunderstand and resist, and yet are never abandoned or rejected, but always invited again toward deeper communion. The displays around them now showed something that David's eyes could barely process: simultaneous images of subatomic particles dancing in precise patterns, cells dividing and specializing into organs, children learning to speak their first words, artists creating beauty from raw materials, scientists making breakthrough discoveries, mystics experiencing union with the divine, and somehow all of it was revealed as aspects of the same fundamental movement, the same invitation, the same love-calling consciousness toward ever fuller participation. In the life of God, when you leave this chamber, the being continued, its form beginning to fade, as if this encounter was approaching its conclusion, you will carry this understanding with you, that the mystery of Mount Sinai is the mystery of God's continuous choice to bridge every divide, to speak through whatever medium creation can receive, to use stars and prophets and ancient alien guardians, and most fully a human life lived in perfect love, as the vocabulary through which the infinite communicates with the finite, inviting all of us, human and otherwise, into the great dance of existence that is simultaneously scientific and spiritual, cosmic and intimate, unfolding according to natural law and sustained moment by supernatural grace. David stood speechless, his archaeologist's mind racing to categorize and analyze what he was experiencing, even as his heart simply opened to receive it. And in that tension between analytical understanding and experiential knowing, he felt himself standing precisely at the threshold the Watcher had described, the choice point where humanity must learn to hold both realities without reducing either to the other. The Watcher extended what David could only describe as a hand, though its form remained fluid and uncertain, composed of light that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could properly register. And when those luminous fingers touched the air before them, the entire chamber responded, as if reality itself was a canvas being painted upon by consciousness that predated matter. The crystalline walls dissolved into pure darkness, Not the absence of light, but rather the pregnant void from which light itself emerged, and then slowly, with the patience of a gardener tending the first shoots of spring, points of brilliance began to appear, stars being born in the infinite deep, galaxies spinning into their majestic spiral forms, clusters of cosmic matter drawing together under the invisible hand of gravity, which David now understood was simply another name for the attractive force of divine love, pulling creation toward ever greater unity. "Behold," the being whispered, and in that single word, David heard echoes of every prophet who had ever commanded human attention toward truth too vast for comfortable comprehension. The map of sacred relationship that has existed since the first moment of creation, the network through which consciousness reaches toward its source. The web of worlds where God has chosen to kindle the fire of awareness and invite it toward participation in eternal life. David's breath caught in his throat as the cosmic display zoomed inward, moving past galaxies and nebulae, focusing on specific solar systems that glowed with a golden radiance, distinct from the ordinary light of their stars. And he realized he was seeing not merely physical space, but spiritual geography, a topology of grace that transcended mere distance, and mapped instead the distribution of worlds where beings had awakened to the question of their own existence and reached upward toward answers that could only come from beyond themselves. Each of these lights represents a world where consciousness has evolved to the threshold of self-awareness, the Watcher explained. And David saw hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions of them scattered across the visible universe, like jewels sewn into dark fabric, each one pulsing with its own rhythm, its own unique frequency of awakening. Some have already crossed the threshold you now approach, integrating their technological capabilities with spiritual maturity, learning to wield the powers of creation with the wisdom and humility required to use such powers in harmony with divine purpose, rather than in destructive rebellion against it. David watched as certain nodes in the network glowed more brightly, their light seemingly more stable and pure, and he understood without being told that these represented civilizations that had successfully navigated the dangerous passage between gaining godlike powers and cultivating godlike character, that had not destroyed themselves in the adolescence of their cosmic awakening, but had surrendered their will to the greater will that moved through all things. "Others have failed," the being continued, and David's heart clenched as he saw certain lights flicker and dim, some fading to darkness entirely, and he knew he was witnessing the tragedy of worlds that had chosen isolation over communion, domination over service, fear over love, and had consequently removed themselves from the network not because God abandoned them, but because they had turned away from the light that would have guided them through their moment of crisis. And still others remain where you are now, poised at the edge, their future not yet written, their choice not yet made, capable of either transcendence or catastrophe, depending on whether they can learn to hold together the twin truths of cosmic insignificance and infinite belovedness. David saw Earth appear in the display, that familiar blue and green sphere that held everyone he had ever known, every story he had ever studied, every hope and fear of his own heart, and around it the golden light pulsed with particular intensity, as if his world occupied some special position in the network that he could not yet fully comprehend. "Your planet is what we call a crucible world," the Watcher said, and its voice carried weight that made David's knees weaken, forcing him to steady himself against one of the crystalline surfaces that had rematerialized around them. A place where the Creator has invested particular attention, particular love, particular presence, because from the beginning it was chosen not merely as another node in the network, but as the site of the ultimate revelation, the place where God would demonstrate once and for all the depths of divine commitment to creation by entering fully into creaturely existence. The cosmic map shifted, zooming closer to Earth until David could see the golden threads connecting his world to the others. But now he noticed something he had missed before. The threads did not merely touch Earth's surface, but converged on specific points in history, specific moments that blazed with such intensity they outshone everything around them. The incarnation, the being continued, and David saw one point burning brighter than all the rest. A light so powerful it sent ripples through the entire network, waves of spiritual energy that reached across space and time to touch every other world connected to the web. Was not merely a local event but a cosmic declaration, a definitive answer to the question that every conscious being across every world eventually asks: does the Creator truly care? And if so, how deeply? And is there any limit to divine love's willingness to pursue and redeem what has gone astray? David watched in awe as the light from that single point, a stable in Bethlehem, a life lived in Palestine, a cross on Golgotha, an empty tomb on the third day, spread outward like dawn breaking across the universe. And he understood that beings on worlds he could not name had witnessed this event through means he could not comprehend, that the Watchers themselves had stood vigil across the cosmos as God entered human form, and demonstrated that no suffering was too great, no humiliation too complete, no death too final to prevent the divine love from pursuing its beloved creation into the deepest darkness and bringing it home again. You asked earlier why your scriptures matter in a universe so vast, the Watcher said, calling back to a question David had posed in what felt like hours ago, though time had become elastic and uncertain in this chamber beneath the mountain. They matter because they record the central event of cosmic history, the moment when the creator of galaxies became a creature within one galaxy, when the infinite accepted finitude, when the author of life experienced death, and in doing so revealed that every world connected to this network is invited into the same relationship, the same adoption, the same destiny of union with God, through the same Christ who was fully human and fully divine, fully particular to your world, and fully universal in significance. David felt tears flowing freely now, his academic skepticism utterly dissolved before the magnitude of what he was being shown. And he thought of every Christmas carol he had sung without fully believing, every communion wafer he had taken out of cultural habit rather than genuine faith, every gospel passage he had analyzed as historical text rather than receiving as living truth. And all of it now blazed with new meaning that made his heart feel simultaneously broken and whole. Humanity's destiny, the being said, gesturing toward the cosmic map where Earth's golden light continued to pulse and strengthen, is not to remain isolated in your single solar system, congratulating yourselves on technological achievements while remaining spiritual infants, but to join this network as awakened children of God, to take your place among the communion of conscious beings who have chosen to align their existence with divine purpose, to contribute your unique voice to the symphony of praise and service and creative love that echoes through creation from its beginning to its end. David saw the vision shift one final time, showing Earth's light growing stronger, its connections to other worlds multiplying and deepening, and alongside the beauty of that potential future, he glimpsed the shadow of an alternative, his world isolated, its light dimming, humanity having gained the stars only to lose its soul, achieving technological transcendence while rejecting spiritual transformation. And he knew without question which future he wanted, which future he would spend whatever remained of his life working to help manifest, regardless of whether anyone believed the story of what had happened to him in this impossible chamber beneath Mount Sinai. The Watcher's form began to dim, its luminous presence gradually withdrawing like tide water receding from shore, and David felt panic rise in his chest because he was not ready for this to end, not ready to return to a world that would never again feel solid or knowable in the way it once had, not ready to carry alone the weight of what he had witnessed in this chamber where time and eternity touched. "Wait," he whispered, his voice hoarse from emotion and the dryness of the desert air that somehow still existed beyond this sacred space. "I don't understand what you want me to do with all of this. I'm just one person, an archaeologist who studies dead civilizations, who has spent his career examining fragments and trying to reconstruct meaning from silence. How can I possibly convey what has happened here when I barely have the language to describe it even to myself?" The being paused in its fading, and David felt its attention return to him with the full weight of an intelligence that had observed human history since before recorded time began. And in that gaze he experienced something he had not expected, not judgment or disappointment at his inadequacy, but rather a compassion so complete it made him understand that every fear and doubt he harbored was already known and already loved, that his weakness was not an obstacle to the mission being entrusted to him, but rather the very qualification that made him suitable. "David," the Watcher spoke his name with such tenderness that it reminded him of how his mother had said it when he was a child waking from nightmares, when the simple sound of his own identity spoken with love was enough to anchor him back in reality and safety. "You were not brought here because of your strength, but because of your honesty. Not because you had already believed, but because you had genuinely sought truth, even when it contradicted your assumptions. And what the world needs now is not another voice of certainty shouting doctrine into the void, but rather witnesses who can speak of transformation with the authority of lived experience rather than inherited tradition." The crystalline walls of the chamber began to resonate with a tone that David felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears, a vibration that seemed to be calibrating his very cells to carry forward the imprint of this encounter, and he realized that he was being changed on some fundamental level, that whatever happened next in his life would be colored by this moment. The way sunlight passing through stained glass is transformed into patterns of sacred color that illuminate what was previously mundane shadow. "You will return to your world," the being continued, and now its form was almost entirely transparent, barely distinguishable from the ambient light that filled the chamber, and you will face doubt both from others and from within yourself on the mornings when this experience feels like it might have been hallucination or dream. And in those moments you must remember that faith has always required choosing to trust in what was, revealed during clarity, even when you are walking through fog. David nodded, tears still flowing, but his breathing steadier now, and he understood that he was being given not a burden, but a gift, that the fear of being unable to fulfill this calling was itself a form of pride that assumed his own capacities mattered more than the power of truth, to make itself known through whatever imperfect vessels were willing to speak it. "Tell them," the Watcher said, and its voice was now barely a whisper reaching across increasing distance. "Tell them that they are not accidents in an indifferent universe, but beloved children of a Creator who has been pursuing them since before the first star. Ignited, tell them that the same God who fashioned galaxies knows every hair on their heads and every longing in their hearts. Tell them that science and faith are not enemies but complementary languages describing the same ultimate reality. Tell them that they were made for communion, not just with each other, but with beings across the cosmos who share their divine origin and their eternal destiny. And above all, tell them that in Jesus they have seen the face of God reaching into human experience to demonstrate that no one is too lost, too broken, or too far from home to be welcomed back into the embrace of unconditional love. The chamber itself was dissolving now, the holographic records fading back into crystalline surfaces that were becoming again merely stone, merely ancient rock, shaped by geological processes David could explain with his scientific training, but which would never again feel like only that, only random material forces, because now he knew that even stone carried the fingerprints of intentional design, that Matter itself was an expression of words spoken into being by the creative impulse of consciousness that preceded and sustained all things. David reached out instinctively toward where the watcher had been, his hand grasping empty air that felt somehow charged with residual presence, the way a room still holds the warmth of someone who has just departed. And in that gesture of reaching, he recognized his own condition, and perhaps the condition of all humanity, creatures made to touch the divine, but separated by veils of flesh and time, and the limitations of sensory perception that could only apprehend indirectly what his soul knew immediately to be true. "One last thing," the voice came. Again, though David could no longer see any form to attach it to, and he strained toward the sound like a man in darkness, orienting himself by a distant lighthouse. "The choice your species faces is not whether to reach for the stars, but whether to bring divine love with you when you do, and that choice will not be made by governments or institutions, but by individual hearts that decide moment by moment whether to live for themselves or for something greater. Whether to grasp for power or to surrender to purpose, whether to see others as competitors for scarce resources or as siblings in the family of God." David wanted to respond, to ask 1,000 questions that were suddenly crowding his mind about specifics and timelines, and how exactly this choice would manifest in the mundane reality of politics and economics and cultural change. But before he could form words, the presence was gone completely, vanished as thoroughly as if it had never existed, leaving him alone in a stone chamber that was rapidly becoming indistinguishable from any other cave carved by wind and water over countless centuries. The silence that followed was absolute, and somehow louder than any sound David had ever heard, a quiet so complete it seemed to erase even the memory of noise. And he stood motionless for long minutes, simply breathing and trying to orient himself in a world that looked identical to the one he had known before, but which he now understood was saturated with meaning and purpose and presence far beyond what his previous materialist framework had allowed him to perceive. When he finally moved toward the passage that would lead him back to the surface, back to his tent and his equipment, and the concerns of academic publication and professional reputation that suddenly seemed both completely trivial and infinitely important, because everything mattered when understood as part of God's unfolding story, David felt something shift in his chest, a settled certainty that had nothing to do with empirical proof and everything to do with recognition, the way you know your own face in the mirror, even though you cannot explain exactly how you distinguish it from every other arrangement of features. And he knew that whether anyone believed his account or not, whether his career survived this testimony or not, whether he was celebrated as a visionary or dismissed as mentally unstable, he would speak what he had witnessed, because silence in the face of such revelation would be a betrayal not just of the watcher who had trusted him with this message, but of every human being who deserved to know that their deepest longings for meaning and connection and transcendence were not delusional fantasies, but accurate intuitions of their true nature and ultimate home. He emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of the Sinai desert, the stars still visible overhead in their ancient configurations that had guided travelers and mystics for millennia, and David looked up at those distant fires burning across unimaginable distances and felt for the first time that he was not looking at cold nuclear reactions, but at fellow participants in a cosmic community bound together by the love of a creator who had made all of it, all of them, for purposes that encompassed both the grandest sweep of galactic evolution and the smallest movement of individual choice. And he knew that his life's meaning was no longer to be found in reconstructing the past, but in helping to build a future where humanity finally understood itself as it truly was. Not alone, not abandoned, not random products of blind chance, but cherished children of God being called home across the stars to take their place at the table prepared for them since before the foundation of the world. What truth has been hidden from you that your heart has always known? Subscribe to continue this journey into the mysteries that unite heaven and earth.